Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 107. Well, stay tuned for more from Glory in our midst this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. Ready to go. What about you?
I'm definitely ready to go. Now, are you stuck in the polar vortex that is crossing the nation?
No, it's actually, well, it's cool here, but nothing like they're experiencing. We needed a little light jacket today. We suffered.
Thinking of our friends in Chicago who are experiencing sub-zero temperatures.
Yeah.
But this is some really good material this week. I have a confession to make before we get off the ground with our discussion. I have not read Glory in Our Midst until this series that we're going through. Kline just told us when we were in Prophets class that it was essentially the stuff that he was talking about in class. And so I bought the book, but I haven't read it until now. And wow, this week's stuff I'm really excited about.
Good. Then you bring fresh eyes to it. That's always good.
Well, before we jump right in, I'll just run through the regular housekeeping. We do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. And there you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. If you do purchase a book or any other item that is linked for sale there, it does help me out a little bit. So thank you to those who have been buying things there. And if you can give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcatcher, both of those things help to boost our visibility to others who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means and you'd like to pitch in a little extra to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and anything that you can give is much appreciated and really encourages Todd and I. So thank you again to everyone who has donated. It really means a lot. Okay, Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you now to kick off our discussion.
Okay, well, let's start with a quick review. We've been looking at the vision in chapter 1, starting in verse 8. And Kline has talked about the depths that the horsemen are among the myrtle trees by or near the depths. And Kline talked about how the depths are the depths of the sea, and the sea representing those evil powers that would keep God's people from experiencing the promises being fulfilled for them. And then last week, he spent time on the myrtle trees, how the myrtle trees, the wonderful flowers and look of the trees pictured paradise. And he connected also the myrtle trees in the vision with the Feast of Tabernacles and the building of booths, which used partially myrtle leaves in the construction. And the connection was that this was also a picture of while God's people are in the wilderness, that God is still blessing them with his presence, as well as a promise of the future, that God would bring them through the depths of the sea, through that which would threaten them, into the grace of God. And so there's a present aspect being fulfilled now of the myrtle tree, that wherever God is with his people, there is protection and blessing. And even Kline talks about transformation inwardly. And at the same time, it's a look to the future, that while the depths still exist, while we're in this wilderness wandering time, that there is a future that God is bringing us to, and he will ensure it happens. And so where we are today, which is page 31, it's the State of the World report. Angels have come back from a mission, And they were reporting to the chief angel or the angel of the Lord of what they've seen. And so Kline talks about this section then in verse 9 and following shows that the mission of the writers was to see the nations that threaten God's plan for his people. And so that God has jurisdiction over the deep. He's not simply in Israel watching over God's people as they try to rebuild the temple, but the vision shows that God is also active across the world, and especially with an eye toward anything that would endanger his promise for his people. And from the perspective of Israel, the nations had already seemed to subvert the Davidic dynasty because there is no son of David on the throne when that Davidic dynasty was destroyed in a sense when they were exiled to Babylon. They no longer had a Davidic king. And so from one perspective, it looked like even though they were able to live back in Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, that the nation still actually had won. And so you have these writers on patrol. And Kline points out the verb halek for patrol is used in Genesis 3:8 for walking. When the Lord came down and was walking, and that was a judgment motif. He came down after Adam and Eve, and he came down to pronounce curse on them. So the sense is looking among the nations, and especially looking at judgment to be done for their judgment to protect God's people. And Leviticus 26:12 uses that same Hebrew word, halek. I will walk among you. And sometimes that's for blessing, but when it comes to the law, of course, it could be for judgment. And he notes that Enoch and Noah, same verb, with God. And we talked about earlier in Kingdom Prologue that meant, among other things, their involvement with the judicial heavenly council. They were the judgments of God against the world, and as prophets, they would deliver that. And one more verse, he talks about Job 1. Satan was walking, and what he's doing, he's securing accusations against man to bring back to God, walking among the earth, around the earth. And so you sort of get the picture of what these angels are doing in the vision, that there's a universal authority of the one sending the angels out through the nations to watch and see what they're doing, preparing to judge and protect, so God would fulfill his promise to Israel. And that's just the part of the fact that they came back to report what they've seen. Let me stop there and get any thoughts from you.
I love the connection back to preceding events, things like events in the Old Testament, especially back to creation with the Lord walking in the garden. I should have done this before we really launched into the discussion, but let me just read the 3 verses that Kline is talking about in the passage that we're discussing in this episode. So this is Zechariah chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Then I said, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel who talked with me said to me, "I will show you what they are." So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, "These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." And they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, "We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest."
Thank you. Yes, and that patrol is the Hebrew word also translated walked elsewhere.
Okay, so that's
go ahead.
That's the connection then between those other passages that you were talking about and Zechariah.
Right, it's the same root Hebrew verb.
Okay.
And it buttresses Kline's argument that in Genesis 3, it's not the Lord walking in the cool of the day that gives this image of sort of a relaxing fellowshipping time with man. God came down in the spirit of the day. And Kline argues that's the spirit of Judgment Day. Because what did he come down to do? To pronounce a curse. Yeah. So it's looking at judgment, and that judgment motif is here in the patrolling. And so that leads here on page 31 to the theological question of verse 12, because we have in verse 12, Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with these 70 years? And the angel of the Lord is the one who calls out. So you have the angel of the Lord, which is the pre-incarnate Son, calling out to the Father in this vision. And the basic question is, as Kline points out, why is there an eschatological delay in bringing in the kingdom? Now, you've brought us back to your land, but the nations still are out there at ease. So why is there no judgment on these nations?
Sort of the other side of the coin from how long, O Lord?
Yes, and Kline's going to point that out in Psalms. It's really the same idea, the how long Psalms. So Kline points out the verse 11, the idea that the nation's at ease is really questioning what's happening compared to what was promised in Jeremiah 30:10, which says, Then fear not, O Jacob, my servant, declares the Lord, nor be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. And so you can understand why this question. The first part of that has been fulfilled. Jacob has returned to Jerusalem, but they're not at ease. They don't have quiet. And there are those out there that can make him afraid. They are subjects of the Persian overlords. The Persians rule. And there are nations, local tribes and nations around them that are stronger than them. And so the question is, Lord, why aren't you fulfilling the rest of your promise? And Kline puts it in a unique way. It's the sea who is at peace here, not Israel. Remember the depths.
Right.
The depths were not churning. The depths were not being defeated. They were just there. And so the sea shouldn't be at peace. Israel should be at peace according to God's promise in Jeremiah 10. Now, Kline brings out one objection to this, and historians point out this can't be accurate because Persia was almost always at war.
Okay.
And so the statement, the nations are at peace, is not really accurate. But Kline points out, first of all, that this is a global mission. So they weren't simply looking at Persia. These angels would go out to every nation in the world and report. But the idea of peace is not that they're not fighting each other. The focus is on God's people and relationship to them. In other words, they're at peace, they're doing what they want, and God is not threatening them because they pose a danger to Israel. And so there's still no Davidic kingship as promised. And Israel has no ability to implement God's law in the sense that they used to when they were sovereign over their nations. Their sovereignty was very limited. And so in that sense, the nations are at, how it pertains to God's people, they're doing whatever they want. And that's the point. As Kline puts it, the world powers are indifferent to God's plan for Israel. And nothing seems to be happening that would change that. And so that's why the angel of the Lord calls out to the Father, where is the rest of this promise where we're at peace and we don't have to be afraid anymore? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. It also seems like part of Kline's point is that the indifference is to Israel's detriment and not to their benefit, because the rest at which the nations of the world are is such that they're not doing anything to help or to benefit God's people.
Yes, and the threat. I mean, what happened 70 years earlier could easily happen again with just a new king
Mm-hmm.
who wasn't friendly to Israel. Another Pharaoh could arise who didn't know Joseph, so to speak. And so there wasn't a lot of ease. Anything that was happening that God was doing had any permanence to it.
Okay.
And so this vision then would encourage them, because it's really the question they would be asking. And of course, they were familiar with Jeremiah's prophecy, and it just didn't seem to be being fulfilled.
Okay.
Now that brings us to verse 34, where Kline points out the antitypical dimension of the fulfillment of this is future, having to do with what Christ would do. So the exile pictured the new covenant deliverance. Returning from exile was coming out of sin and being delivered into the kingdom of God through Christ. And so if that's a picture, then the defeating of the world powers would actually be fulfilled in the antitype, not in the type. So Haggai speaks of a shaking of the heavens when the nations would be defeated in his prophecy. So Kline says the fulfillment of the Jeremiah prophecy is really fulfilled at the second coming of Christ. When all the nations are defeated, all the unbelievers are judged, and God's people live in perfect peace. Another example is some of the prophecy of the exile, of the return, was that when God would gather his people, he would also bring the nations to Israel, and they would bow down to Israel, and the treasures would come into the temple. Well, certainly nothing like that was happening in the time of the writing of Zechariah, but nothing like that happened at all in the Old Testament age.
Right.
There was a time where you could see something like that. And so even that prophecy, like the Jeremiah one, is fulfilled mostly in the return of Christ, when that would literally happen. That brings us to the accuracy of the angel on page 35, unless you want to stop and make some other points.
No, I'm good. Let's keep going.
Okay, so we see in verse 12, the angel of the Lord is making intercession on Israel's behalf, and that's why this is Christ in this picture, as he intercedes on behalf of God's people. And the angel appeals to the integrity of the Lord to fulfill the promise in Jeremiah. The 70 years was over, and Kline points out he also counted the 70 years, and he prayed for restoration because the 70 years were up as he looked back. And the Lord had assured Daniel that this promise would begin to be fulfilled after 70 years. And that's why Daniel is so careful to point out it's after the 70th year that Cyrus decreed the ability for Jews to return. So that's the beginning of that promise already being fulfilled. But the point here is when Zechariah is being written, when he was a prophet, it was about 20 years after that. And so you can see why the angel cries out with how long, because there hadn't been much progress in 20 years.
Right.
I mean, the wall wasn't really complete. The temple was just beginning to be built. They didn't really have their freedom. There was no Davidic king. And so the obvious question arises, where are the rest of the promises? How long until we see them?
Mm.
Now, Kline goes on to point out what would give them a sense even more of the need for the fulfillment is that this number C is not only a literal number, which it is, but it's also symbolic. Because 70 years is 10 sabbatical years that we read elsewhere that they ignored letting the land rest, right?
Okay.
So every 7 years they were supposed to not plow and they would let the land rest, but they never did that. And so the 70 years was considered a punishment of 10 sabbatical years. The number 10, even in Revelation, is a certain amount of time, but it's limited.
Okay.
Like the 10 days of persecution in one of the 7 letters. So the idea is that our punishment has now been completed. The 10 sabbatical years are over. And also, Kline points out that he says 7 years of the was considered a sabbatical year. In a sense, you have 49 years. And so what happened on the 50th year in Israel was Jubilee. It was when the slaves were freed. And so the point being is that symbolically, the 70 years would show them our punishment is complete for disobeying the law. Now, Lord, would you please bring us back and fulfill all your promises? And it's the time for Jubilee.
Right.
Every 7 years of exile is like a sabbatical year. So the 49 is complete. Now it's time. I didn't quote the verses on that, but you find those in the book. And so now is the time of the kingdom against the nations. Now is the time to defeat the nations and bring us that peace and rest that you promised.
Okay.
And so important in biblical theology, Kline goes on to say, is that the Babylonian captivity typified hell because a payment, a punishment for sin was made on the typological level by the Israelites. For example, Leviticus 26:41 says, which made me hostile toward them so that I came into the land of their enemies. Then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they pay for their sin, then God would bring them back. So Leviticus looks ahead to the exile, that the exile would be a punishment. But then you have this statement, after 70 years, they atone for their sin. Because this is all on the typological level, they're not truly, obviously, atoning for their sins in any real way. But in a typological way, in the history of salvation, they have a temporary suffering which pictures hell and paying for punishment. Again, this is all setting up the passive obedience of Christ, just like republication set up the active obedience of Christ, that somebody needs to keep the law to inherit God's blessings. Now, somebody needs to atone for sin to inherit God's blessings.
Amen.
And so we have a picture of hell and then being redeemed from hell through an atoning sacrifice. And so the 70 years of Israel typifies Christ on the cross. And let me just add a side note that Kline doesn't get into here. Often people ask me, being Jewish, they say, what do Jews do with Isaiah 53? Because when you read Isaiah 53, it seems so obvious in the way it's written that you have somebody dying for the sins of others.
Right.
And the way Jews have looked at that is that is the nation Israel. That man is actually the nation. It's collective. Because even here you have that type of thing where Israel collectively as one nation atones for sin by their own punishment. And so the way the Jews look at it is not of an individual at all, of the Messiah. They look at it as Israel being punished and then that punishment being over. And I think that helps because that's just, to us, it seems very clear.
Isaiah 53.
Isaiah 53, but they have found a way around it. That's sort of the way they look at it. But I'll stop there and get your thoughts on everything else we've talked about with this picture of Babylon.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is a point that I remember Kline making in class, but here in the context of Zechariah's first vision, it really seems like Israel has been suffering for their own sin. It's not like a substitute suffering on their behalf, which I think lends itself to the typology of hell here. It's like they were carried off into typological hell.
Yes.
Yeah. And,
yes.
And so something Kline said on page 37, which is, I think, where we're at in our discussion, really struck me. He said, Israel in exile received full equivalence in penal recompense for her sins. Those sufferings were not a sacrificial atonement akin to the propitiatory achievement of the cross. Captive Israel was not the suffering servant heralded by Isaiah, the vicariously suffering servant stricken of God for the transgression of others. Her sufferings were rather the kind of reparations paid by those condemned to hell.
Yes. And Kleinians will love this language, but what we have here then is an intrusion within an intrusion, don't we?
Wow, yeah.
Because Israel is already an intrusion of the common grace order.
Mm-hmm.
We have a kingdom, and we have a covenant of works, just like the garden, and we have a theocracy that pictures heaven. So heaven intrudes in this picture. But within this covenantal structure, within this picture, we have these 70 years of an intrusion, a picture of the gospel,
mm-hmm.
of death and resurrection, of grace, bringing people out through an atonement. And then once they come back, the first intrusion takes over again. We'll talk about that in a moment.
I mean, you can really see, to use a 50-cent word, the pedagogical nature of this, the fact that God is using this to teach them, to drive them to say, we can't do this. We need someone else to do it for us. I mean, it just seems clearly to be driving in that direction.
Yep. Yeah, can you imagine a sermon title in the bulletin, The Intrusion Within the Intrusion? Well, let's move on to page 37, the poignant appeal. So you see, again, why this appeal needs to be made. The temple is not rebuilt. There are trouble from neighbors. We see that in the book of Nehemiah, for example. The building the wall project has obstacle after obstacle. The land is still unproductive. The nation Israel has still been devastated by the captivity and by Babylon. There's no self-rule government. There's no son of David on the throne. And so you have this cry out, why? Why are these happening? Well, how long, Lord, until this happens? And of course, verse 12 is how he phrases it. How long will you withhold mercy? That's the idea of the fulfillment, the rest of your promises. Now, how long, Kline points out, throughout the Psalms usually assumes the Lord's displeasure. Lord, why have you turned your face from me? That idea is common in the Psalms. So it's an assumption that, well, if you're not fulfilling your promise, you must still have displeasure.
Mm.
So it's a genuine question from the Israelites. Why are my enemies still all around us if we've already paid for our sin? And so Kline points out that the how longs of the Old Testament are also for us, because we're still waiting for the fulfillment of the promises. And even in the book of Revelation, the saints, the souls of the saints, what are they crying out? How long, Lord?
Right.
As they look down on the earth. And we shouldn't assume, now that we know even more clearly what Christ has done, the Lord's displeasure. At the same time, we always are crying out, how long? When we see the world around us or our own weaknesses. Well, that brings us to page 38, the sojourning saints. The solution to the cry, Kline points out, really will come on Judgment Day in the return of Christ. And so they're going to have to wait a long time for this really to be fulfilled, where all God's enemies would be defeated and they would be in perfect rest and peace. On a spiritual level, that would happen really in the new covenant, when at least our souls are in peace, that we're made right with God through the atonement and we're filled with his Spirit. But completely it'll be at the return of Christ. Mm. Now, Kline points out there is at least one aspect of the promise that they'll see on the typological level, and that is the completion of the temple. And that was part of the promise, that the temple that was destroyed would be rebuilt. They would at least see that happen in the Old Testament era. And yet the rest of the Old Testament, they would not see any changes to their situation. After Persia, you have, of course, Greece and Rome. So, the world, the bestial powers are still there throughout the entire Old Testament. And Kline raises a question then, why was there no solution, at least on the typological level in the Old Testament? Why was it really so limited to just the temple? Why didn't, at least in a typological sense, they start experiencing that real peace and safety from their enemies? And Kline has two answers to that question. One, because they're still under the covenant of works, the typological covenant of works in Deuteronomy 28. And because they're under that, they haven't fulfilled it yet. And, their rest would come in obeying the law as a nation.
Mm.
So that arrangement has not been abrogated just because he brought them back. And that's really the whole theme of Nehemiah. Unfortunately, in Nehemiah, it is often read in a way that ignores its place in redemptive history. And Nehemiah is a very negative, sad book. Nehemiah is not a hero. Nehemiah represents the law.
Mm.
Because now that they're back, and even though they've put away the idols, because that's what they were punished for, their idolatry. And so now they've put away their idols. They're back in Jerusalem. They're building the true temple. And yet, Nehemiah lists all the other failing, all the other laws that they have broken. Marrying pagan women, working on the Sabbath. And at one point, towards the end of Nehemiah, you remember he pulls their hair and he beats them. And that's not an example, pastors, for what we do. I know some of you pastors may not believe that. He may be your hero. But Nehemiah is representing the works principle, that's how the law comes. Do this and live. And then when we're not doing it, it pronounces a judgment.
Mm.
And so even though they're back in the land, the very fact that Nehemiah has to treat them this way and sort of force them to obey the law, even though they don't really want to, shows how this is still going to fail, that they're still going to be judged. Even though outwardly they may congratulate themselves that they've put away idols, their hearts are, as we see with the Pharisees, of course, are dead.
So their probation is not going well.
Yes, they think that probation is over. But the whole book of Nehemiah, by the time we get to the second half, shows that it's not over. They're still in danger. And of course, the very last word of the Old Testament in Malachi is the word curse. Curse is still coming. And so that's why Kline says there is no real, even on the typological level, a fulfillment of the promise where they can say, now we're at peace. Not while they're still under the works arrangement that they're failing.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the second reason then, of course, is to push them to cry out for the Messiah. Because if those promises are not being fulfilled, then they need one to come and bring about the fulfillment. They need one to deliver them from their enemies.
Right.
And if they were already delivered, why would they cry out for a deliverer?
There you go.
And so, again, Kline goes on to say, in the new covenant, we're in the same situation. According to the book of Revelation, the beast still has power. The rulers of the world do what they want. They're not concerned about the church and what we say. And so we're in the same situation, and we look to the return of Christ for the fulfillment. We don't look for that in this life. We look to the same. And so by crying out to God and saying, how long? The angel is looking past the Old Testament type to the one who would fulfill it. And ironically, Kline points out, the one who's asking is the one who would fulfill. And that's the great irony and beauty of this vision.
Wow, yeah.
So his cry reveals his passionate love that Israel still needs his sins atoned for to bring us into the kingdom. And he's the one that's going to do it.
Mm.
So it's so rich and beautiful what's happening here with the angel of the Lord being the one to intercede on behalf of Israel to bring the promise.
Absolutely. That is beautiful.
Well, let's close then with this final section where Kline calls it judge and advocate, because that's exactly what we just said, that Christ then takes on a dual role here. And on the one hand, he's the judge of the nations, because he's the leader, he's the military leader on this horse in the vision. So he is the one that's going to judge the nations and bring God's people into that peace. But he's also the interceder. He's the advocate of his people in giving the prayer. So he's the priest and he's the king in this vision itself. The king who rules and judges, and the priest who will intercede and become a sacrifice to bring about the promise. And Kline says this dual role will come back at different times throughout the book. Zechariah 3 is one example. He is the judge of Joshua the high priest, but he also becomes the advocate for Joshua the high priest.
Mm.
And so the theology of Jesus as priest king is right here with the same figure ruling and then interceding. And so already we see that the one who defeats Satan will defeat Satan, the true enemy of God's people, by enduring suffering and becoming an atonement for sin. He will do that as the king and as the priest. All that is here in this dual role. And so he becomes the one that can save any sinner, because he is both the king, he is both the king and the priest. And we can trust him then to do exactly what he asked the Father to do, because he will fulfill what he's asking in his death and resurrection. So the important point this brings to an end is that the next section of Zechariah is how the Father responds to his advocacy. Because he is the one, he is the Holy One that can get a positive response from the Father. The Father now brings a positive response to the question. And that's what we'll look at next time.
Excellent. I can't wait.
Any other thoughts about the richness of this vision?
I'm just really appreciating the points you wrapped up with there, because Jesus is not only the one who judges, and we see that especially in the book of Revelation coming as the judge, but he's also the priest who stands in our way and bears the very judgment that we deserve. I mean, you just can't get any better than that.
Yeah. Amen.
So,
well, we'll get more richness as we look at next week's answer to this plea.
Good. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for leading that discussion, Todd.
Sure.
All right, everyone. We would love to hear what you think, so please do email your comments, your questions, your thoughts to glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux, and the podcast itself is at Glory Cloud Pod. And you can join the discussion in the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast, and they can get you added. And Todd and I will talk to you again next week.